now let's leave enzymes behind, but a lot of enzymes will be carried forward in the next topic, that is enzymes. A lot of proteins, I'm sorry, will be carried forward in enzymes, which again happens to be a major topic. A lot of questions have been asked from this topic. Let's start off. So what exactly are enzymes? Enzymes happen to be biological catalysts, most of which are proteins in nature. Exception is ribozyme, which happens to be in RNA. So they are biological catalysts. What are catalysts? Something that increases the rate of a reaction without undergoing any change in itself. They are colloidal. Why? They are proteins in nature. So they are high molecular weight, so they do not form true solutions. They are thermolabile, that means they are affected by temperature. And one very important property of enzyme is that they are extremely specific in their action. So this is what allows, so they are catalysts, they speed up the reaction, and what they will do is that they will convert a reactant into a product without forming too many byproducts. So specific products are formed. Okay. Now the enzymes, many of them are active on their own, but some of them require additional groups for their activity. This group, if it's an organic molecule, it's called as a coenzyme. If it's inorganic in nature, it is. If it's organic in nature, it's called as coenzyme. If it's inorganic, it's called as the cofactor. Okay. Now we look at the structure of the enzyme. So the protein part of the enzyme is called as the apoenzyme. When it combines with the non-protein part, which is called as the coenzyme, if you look at the definition of a coenzyme, this can be called as the low molecular weight, organic, okay, dialysable non-protein part of the enzyme. So the apoenzyme combines with the coenzyme to form holoenzyme. It is the apoenzyme that gives specificity. Coenzyme does not give specificity to the enzyme. It's that activity is because of the apoenzyme. Now let's see what happens next. Now we want to see how these enzymes, excuse me, there's a small technical problem. I'm not able to move on to the next slide.
Hello.
Hello.
Ma'am, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You could just do one thing. Just stop the share screen and once again come back to share screen. Then check.
Okay.
Just check.
Okay.
Come back on the share screen. Now see if you could proceed.
Let me see. Okay. I'll have to. So sorry, there was a small issue. We'll just set it right in a minute.
Yeah.
So what I was trying to say is that an enzyme combines, so the apoenzyme, that is the protein part of the enzyme, that combines with the non-protein part, that is called as the coenzyme, and this results in formation of the holoenzyme. Now let's see what is the mechanism of action of the enzyme. Now the enzyme basically contains an active site. Now what exactly is this active site? The active site happens to be a cleft or a crevice that's present on the surface of the enzyme. It is at this active site that you find the substrate coming and binding. So the substrate binds at the active site. Now when the substrate binds at this active site, basically what happens is that the coenzyme also has a place for the binding of the substrate, for the binding. The coenzyme is called as the co-substrate. In the process, the reaction occurs. For example, suppose we are considering a dehydrogenase. So what a dehydrogenase essentially does is that it is removing hydrogens. So in this process, it's the coenzyme, for example, FAD or NAD, that's acting as the coenzyme. That's the one that acts as the acceptor of this hydrogens. And in the process, your reactants get converted into product. Now the products do not have the same kind of affinity for the enzyme, so they are dislodged and you get the enzyme as it is. Now what exactly does the, yes?
Sorry for interrupting you. You could just resume your slideshow. You can click on the slideshow.
Yeah. Just a moment. I am having a little bit of an issue here.
Because now it is showing the grid format where you can see the slides.
Yeah, I know, sir, but I'm, somehow मेरे को कुछ problem आ रहा है.
Okay, sir. Hello.
Yeah, is that okay now?
Yes.
Yeah. So what we now find is that you've got the enzyme. When it reacts, what happens is every molecule, before it forms a product, it has to absorb certain amount of energy. This energy is called as the energy of activation, and this forms a transition state. And at the transition state, the molecule becomes unstable, and in the process, it gets converted to the product. Now, in the presence of an enzyme, what happens is the energy of activation is decreased, as a result of which more and more molecules will be able to achieve the transition state, and therefore you have more product being formed, or the rate of the reaction increases. So remember always, the enzymes will increase the rate of the reaction without affecting the equilibrium. So they achieve this by decreasing the energy of activation. The next very important topic that we'll discuss is the classification of enzymes. So initially, when enzymes were discovered, some of them just got random names, but most of the enzymes you'll find that they have this name ending with ASE. So the suffix ASE is added to the names of most enzymes. So either it will tell you about the substance on which they act, or it tells you some idea about the chemical action. For example, it's a protease or a lipase. Okay, so these kind of things. But later on, as more and more enzymes were discovered, it became imperative to classify the enzymes. You could not just keep giving names to the enzyme. So the International Union of Biochemistry appointed an enzyme commission in 1961, which came to force in 1964. And now we have the International Union of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, which take care of the classification of enzyme. Each enzyme has been described by a 4-digit classification number, which is called as the EC number. And each enzyme has got 4 digits to its name. Okay, so the first digit indicates the class, the subclass, the sub-subclass, and the specific enzyme. And the enzymes are divided into 6 main classes. In fact, recently they have added a 7th class, but as of now, we'll just talk about the 6 main classes of enzymes. So let's have a look at them. The mnemonic that you can use to remember this is OTHLIL. Okay, so OTHLIL, remember that you need to remember the names of the enzymes in the same sequence. So for example, the class 1 will always be oxidoreductases, which participate, these are enzymes participating in oxidation reduction reaction. Class 2 is transferases. These are the enzymes which are involved in transfer of groups. Class 3 is hydrolases, which break a bond by adding water. Lyases also could break a bond, but water is not involved. Isomerases simply cause rearrangement within a molecule. And ligases are involved in bond formation utilizing ATP. So you have to remember these 6 classes in the same sequence. Usually you're expected to give an example from each category. If it's been asked as an LAQ, it's better that you also give a reaction. Now, reaction is something that scares most people out, and you feel that you're not able to remember the reactions at the last moment. So I would always suggest that pathways that you need, rather than remembering some obscure enzyme, you remember the pathways that you have done, and I'm sure that you're going to be finding examples from these pathways. For example, when we talk about oxidoreductases, so any enzyme which has got a name like dehydrogenase or oxidase or reductase or monooxygenase is basically an oxidoreductase. So when you're talking about oxidoreductases, think about the TCA cycle. So you have malate dehydrogenase, you've got alpha ketoglutarate dehydrogenase, you have succinate dehydrogenase. In glycolysis, you had pyruvate dehydrogenase, later you had lactate dehydrogenase. So all those reactions you people would know, and it can be given as example. Now for transferases, we recently did transamination reactions. So transaminases happen to be transferases. Now let's just go back to the urea cycle. So when we say transferases, if you remember ornithine transcarbamylase, so it's transferring something. So therefore, it's an example of a transferase. Then when we say hydrolase, remember that all your digestive enzymes basically happen to be hydrolases. Again, you go back to the urea cycle, you find that you have this enzyme arginase, the last enzyme, 5th reaction. It adds a molecule of water and breaks a bond, forms urea as a byproduct. So arginase is an example of a hydrolase. Next, you have lyase. Again, in the urea cycle, you have arginosuccinate lyase. Or in the process of glycolysis, you have aldolase that converts fructose 1,6-biphosphate to DHAP and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Okay, so that's an example of lyase. Now, isomerases, go back to glycolysis. Second reaction, glucose 6-phosphate getting converted to fructose 6-phosphate, phosphoglucoisomerase, or DHAP getting converted to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, triose phosphate isomerases. And the last reaction, ligases, in the urea cycle again, the first reaction is carbamoyl phosphate synthetase. Then in between, you again had arginosuccinate synthetase. That's why I said always remember to use the name synthetase. Synthetases will use ATP and they always happen to be ligases. Whereas if you think of citrate synthase, there is no ATP that is involved. So the synthases happen to be lyases. So this is an extremely important topic that all of you need to remember at all times. This can be very important in vivo also. The next topic is factors affecting enzyme activity. Again, I keep saying all these topics seem to be very important. This again has been asked in the form of an SAQ. LAQ के form में भी पूछा गया. So they'll ask you to enumerate the various factors that affect enzyme activity and ask you to describe any one, or they will specify which factor to be described. So I'll only consider the 4 important topics today. So the first one happens to be concentration of enzyme. Second one, concentration of substrate, temperature and pH. Let's have a look at this one by one. The first factor, enzyme concentration. एक गलती जो सब लोग करते हैं, हमेशा याद रखो, y-axis पे you'll always put the rate of the reaction or the velocity. The other variable that you're considering will always come on the x-axis. So here it's the enzyme concentration. So in the absence of the enzyme, what happens is the rate of the reaction is practically negligible. So it is 0. As you go on increasing the enzyme concentration, the rate of the reaction proportionately increase. So what you're going to be getting is a straight line. And this particular property can be used for finding out the concentration of enzymes during diagnosis. Second factor happens to be the substrate concentration. And in this, you'll find that the graph, what you get when you plot substrate concentration against the rate of the reaction, what you're going to be getting is a rectangular hyperbola. So in this, you find that the initial part, which I have written as A, you find that as you increase the substrate concentration, the rate of the reaction proportionately increases. So it's a straight line. Then the part that's labeled as B, what you find is there is an increase, but it's not a proportional increase. So the graph kind of curves. And in the last part, any further increase in the substrate concentration does not increase the velocity. So your graph, it becomes a plateau, forms a plateau. So essentially the graph becomes a rectangular hyperbola. The maximum velocity that can be achieved by any reaction is what is called as Vmax. And the substrate concentration that is needed to achieve half Km. And all this is put together in the form of a very important equation, that is V is equal to Vmax multiplied by substrate concentration upon Km plus substrate concentration, where Vmax and Km value, these are constants. Km is called as the Michaelis-Menten constant. And this Km value, it tells you about the association between the enzyme and the substrate. If the Km value is low, it means the enzyme has great affinity for the substrate. A high Km value indicates that the enzyme has low affinity for the substrate. Then the effect of temperature, we find again that as you initially increase the temperature, the graph, it forms a linear curve. It reaches a optimum point beyond which what happens, any further increase in temperature results in a decrease, or there is a fall in the enzyme activity. Therefore, the final graph that is formed is a bell-shaped curve. Okay, so don't call it as a mountain-shaped curve, it's a bell-shaped curve. And the temperature at which maximum velocity is seen is what is called as the optimum temperature. Within our body, optimum temperature usually happens to be 37 degrees centigrade, but in vitro, it could be 40 degrees. But again, now this is not true for all enzymes. There are certain enzymes which may withstand higher temperatures. For example, urease can withstand temperatures as high as 60 degrees. And in the case of Taq DNA polymerase, even 100 degrees centigrade is okay. Then the effect of pH, you find a graph that is similar to the effect of temperature. Here again, you find a bell-shaped curve. So every enzyme has got an optimum pH at which maximum activity is seen. Above and below this pH, you find that there is a loss of activity. And here again, the loss of activity is because of the denaturation of the enzyme, which happens to be a protein in nature. Now, in the case of optimum pH, most enzymes have their optimum pH in the range of the physiological pH, but it will also depend upon the compartment in which they are functioning. For example, you'll find that pepsin has an optimum pH between 1 to 2, acid phosphatase has an optimum pH between 3 to 4, alkaline phosphatase has an optimum pH of 8 to 10. So each enzyme has an optimum pH at which it will show best activity. Another very important question, or another very important topic, is the enzyme inhibition. Now, what is an inhibitor? It's a molecule that can bind to the enzyme, and as a result of which it can decrease the enzyme activity. Inhibition can be of three types. You can have reversible inhibition, irreversible inhibition, and allosteric inhibition. We first talk about reversible inhibition, which can again be of three types: competitive, non-competitive, or uncompetitive inhibition. Usually questions have been asked to either write a short note on competitive inhibition or to compare competitive and non-competitive inhibition with examples. So let's see first what is competitive inhibition. So as the name indicates, competition. So here you have an inhibitor that very closely resembles the structure of the actual substrate, and therefore it's called as the substrate analog. And there is a competition between the two to bind to the active site of the enzyme. Now, if the normal substrate, so as you see, the substrate and the inhibitor, they are structurally similar, they're not the same. So if the substrate is able to bind to the active site first, you get the formation of the enzyme substrate complex, which can form the product. If the inhibitor comes and binds here, it will prevent the substrate from binding, and there will be no formation of the product. Competitive inhibition can be overcome by increasing substrate concentration. You find that in competitive inhibition, the Km value increases, but the Vmax remains unchanged. Now, if the inhibitor is structurally similar to some metabolite and it inhibits some kind of a metabolic process in the body, the inhibitor is referred to as an anti-metabolite. And if this anti-metabolite resembles the structure of a vitamin, it is referred to as an anti-vitamin. And both these anti-metabolites and anti-vitamins, they have been used for therapeutic purposes. And this question is also often asked as to give examples of therapeutic uses of competitive inhibition. Remember one thing, the most common example that students write, that succinate dehydrogenase is inhibited by malonate. Okay, this is not an example of a therapeutic use of competitive inhibition. So maybe you people can make a table like this for yourself, and whenever you're giving examples, don't remember all the examples. Don't make things too tough for yourselves. At least remember 4 good examples where you'll be able to write this systematically as to what is the substrate, which is the inhibitor, which is the enzyme that's being inhibited, and therefore what is the therapeutic use, or what is the condition that it is being used to treat. For example, if I consider here, you've got the substrate that is hypoxanthine or xanthine, that is the actual substrate for the enzyme xanthine oxidase. So you've got allopurinol. This allopurinol happens to be something that mimics the structure of hypoxanthine, and therefore it is able to inhibit the enzyme xanthine oxidase, and this is effectively used for the treatment of gout. Or for example, you've got vitamin K whose structural analog happens to be dicumarol, and dicumarol will inhibit the enzyme vitamin K epoxide reductase, and therefore this can be used in the case of thrombosis of people who tend to have clot formation. So this can be used as an anticoagulant. So therefore, try to remember at least 3 or 4 good examples of therapeutic uses of competitive inhibition. Next, we come to non-competitive inhibition. Here, as the name indicates, there is no structural similarity. So therefore, there is no competition between the inhibitor and the substrate. Now, the inhibitor here binds to a site other than the active site, as you can see in the diagram. So when the inhibitor binds to another site on the enzyme, what it does is that it distorts the active site and prevents the proper binding between the enzyme and the substrate. So here in this case, even after the substrate is bound, the inhibitor still has the ability to bind to the enzyme substrate complex. So you can have the enzyme substrate complex, you can have enzyme inhibitor complex, you can also get the formation of enzyme substrate inhibitor complex. Again, there could be many examples. Just remember that heavy metals generally bring about inhibition of enzymes by non-competitive method of inhibition. Let's see irreversible inhibition quickly. If an inhibitor binds to the enzyme permanently and therefore distorts the enzyme forever, this kind of inhibition is called as irreversible kind of inhibition. If you remember your ETC, cytochrome oxidase is inhibited by cyanide, as cyanide happens to be an irreversible inhibitor of the enzyme. Similarly, for enolase, the glycolytic enzyme, it is inhibited by fluoride. So fluoride happens to be an irreversible inhibitor. So both these examples, again, this could be asked in MCQs. Cytochrome oxidase being inhibited by cyanide is important from ETC. Fluoride metabolism, again, we'll be seeing this. So remember that both of them happen to be irreversible inhibitors. The next one is allosteric inhibition or regulation. So allosteric inhibition, it's better to call it as regulation. Allos comes from a Greek word that means another. So certain enzymes have got another site, and these enzymes usually happen to be the regulatory enzymes of a process. These are usually bigger in size, and these allosteric enzymes have this allosteric sites wherein they can be regulated. You would feel that this is so similar to non-competitive inhibition. Remember that the non-competitive inhibitor is an external agent, whereas the allosteric regulator happens to be a molecule that is present within the body, and its job is to regulate the enzyme activity. So let's look at it with the help of a diagram. An allosteric regulator could be both positive or negative depending upon what it does to the enzyme. Let's take the example of phosphofructokinase. Now, phosphofructokinase is a key enzyme, key regulatory enzyme of glycolysis. Okay, so this is the allosteric site and this is the active site. Now, what happens is when there is a large amount of ATP, it's an indication that glycolysis need not proceed and glucose need not be broken down for energy production. So, under these circumstances, what happens is ATP acts as a negative allosteric modifier. It binds to this allosteric site, as a result of which the active site is distorted, and this will prevent the substrate from binding and the reaction does not occur. And when the ATP concentration goes down, there is a higher level of AMP. AMP acts as an allosteric, positive allosteric modifier. When that comes and binds to the allosteric site, what happens is the active site of the enzyme that gets modified in a way that now there is better binding between the substrate and the enzyme, and the reaction can proceed. So allosteric regulation, remember, is a very, very important mechanism of regulation of enzyme activity in the body. Next, we have isoenzymes again. Many a time short notes have been asked on this. What are isoenzymes? There are multiple forms of the enzymes that are present in different cells and tissues. Remember, the only common feature between the isoenzymes of a particular kind is that they catalyze the same reaction, but they differ in all other physical and chemical properties. So the amino acid sequence is different, molecular weight is different, temperature optima, the Km value, every other property is different except for the fact that they catalyze the same reaction. One of the most important isoenzymes that's been studied is LDH, which was known to have 5 different isoenzymes. A 6th one has been added most probably. And the increase in the levels of these isoenzymes, they have got diagnostic importance. For example, increase in the level of LDH1 is an indicator, or it can be used for diagnosis of myocardial infarction. Or increase in the levels of LDH5, this can be used for diagnosis of liver and muscle diseases. Similarly, CPK or CK, creatine phosphokinase or creatine kinase as it is called. This also has 3 enzymes which can be used for diagnosis of various conditions. You also have alkaline phosphatase. So here again, you can make a list of certain enzymes which can be used for diagnosis. If they specify isoenzymes used in diagnosis, give examples of only isoenzyme. Or they simply ask you enzymes used as diagnostic agents. You can even mention SGPT, which we studied in transamination. This can be used as a diagnostic marker for viral hepatitis and other liver diseases. SGOT can be used as a marker for myocardial infarction. So you can again make a list of certain enzymes which are used for diagnostic purposes. At least once I've seen that they had also asked for enzyme profile in myocardial infarction. So this kind of a graph is drawn. So we mention as to which is the first enzyme to be released and which is the last one to be released. So as you can see from this figure, CPK or CPK2, the second isoenzyme MB2 as it is called, MB. That's the first one to be released in myocardial infarction, followed by SGOT, and LDH1 is the last enzyme to be released. This question again can be asked in the form of MCQs as to which is the first enzyme to be released or which is the last enzyme to be released in myocardial infarction. And these days, besides these enzyme markers, you also have just protein markers like troponins, which are also excellent markers for diagnosis of myocardial infarction. Now, besides this, enzymes also have therapeutic uses. For example, streptokinase. This is an enzyme that is isolated from streptococcus and useful for clearing blood clots. Asparaginase is used for treatment of leukemia. Here again, you can make a table for yourself, at least have 5 or 6 good examples where you can say the name of the enzyme and the therapeutic application. And please do not confuse therapeutic uses of enzymes with therapeutic uses of competitive inhibition. This is something that I routinely keep seeing in the answers that are written for exams. So therapeutic uses of competitive inhibition wherein we are inhibiting an enzyme, and that is being used as a way of, for treating a condition. And here the enzyme itself is the therapeutic agent. Okay, so that more or less finishes off with enzymes. We move on to the next